Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think I'm just going to wait for a few more minutes while we let people join the room, and then we'll get started. And thanks for writing in the chat, everyone. It's nice to see where everyone is coming here from. Oh, people like your t-shirts.
Oh, and we didn't coordinate.
You didn't?
No.
Mm-hmm. Great minds think alike.
Well, that's what it means to dress up for COVID occasions, right?
Yeah.
Like you just change your t-shirt.
Absolutely. Oh, Claire Dykeman is here from Seattle. This is great. We've got some local folks from the Inwood, Washington Heights area, and then we've got people from all over. Hello from Cooperstown. I'll give it maybe until 6:05 because I know that only about half of the people who registered are in the room right now.
Okay. Great. This is exciting.
Yeah.
It's funny. I feel like there should be like elevator music.
I don't have any queued up to provide.
Right? I'm just like, we need waiting music right now.
Oh, Danita from the Inwood Library. Hi, Danita. Okay, I'll give it one more minute. I'll keep people rolling in. Okay, it's 6:05. I think I'll get started, and anyone else can certainly join us. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first virtual lecture here at the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum. This is part of our August lecture series titled Talking About Race Matters, Join the Conversation. I'm Meredith Horsford. I'm the Executive Director of the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum. And one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is race at the museum. Obviously, a very, very important topic historically, but also a very important topic throughout 2020. Given recent events that are being covered in the news, we at the museum really feel that it's important to facilitate conversations on race, even though sometimes they can be challenging. Because of this, we have put together this series of talks with experts each looking at the topic of race from a different perspective. Our hope is that we can all come together, learn from one another, and continue the conversation. Before we get started, I'd like to get you familiarized with Crowdcast, the platform that we're using today, so that you can get the most out of the lecture tonight and to make sure that if you have questions or comments, we can make sure that the speakers answer them. There is a chat box located on the right-hand side of the screen, which is where you've all been saying hello. If you have technical assistance questions, Melissa, our Development and Community Engagement Manager, can answer them for you in the chat. And if you have questions for the speaker, at the bottom of your screen in the middle, there is a Ask a Question button, and we can be kind of keeping an eye on that throughout the talk, and we'll either answer those questions during, if it makes sense, or at the end of the lecture. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining and supporting us. We really feel strongly that our programming be offered free of charge, which is why this and all of the lecture series are free of charge. But as a small nonprofit organization, we rely on donations and grants so that we can offer programs for free. So if people are interested in making a donation, there is a donate button also at the bottom of your screen, a couple of buttons to the right of the Ask a Question button. So any donations are greatly appreciated. And another thing I want to add is that we have a generous donor who has agreed to match donations during this lecture series up to $4,000. So if you're feeling generous, we would greatly appreciate it. So tonight we are joined by Dr. Sallie Han. Say hi, Sallie. And Dr. Tracy Betsinger.
Hello.
Both are anthropology professors at SUNY Oneonta. Dr. Sallie Han teaches courses in cultural, linguistic, and medical anthropology, and Dr. Tracy Betsinger teaches courses in biological and biocultural anthropology. They will be discussing what is known from the anthropological sciences about race and racism. They draw on their own expertise and experiences as professors of anthropology, people who actively question our assumptions and seek education, and parents raising children to be anti-racist. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sallie and Tracy presenting the Anti-Racism Starter Pack, 5 things to know about race, racism, and anti-racism.
Thanks for that introduction, Meredith. And we're really grateful. I'm going to speak on behalf of Tracy and me for a little bit. We're really grateful to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum for bringing all of us together in this virtual space to have a conversation about these topics, which really I think are on the front of our minds and also being held close in our hearts at the moment. So I'm going to, I have a little, we put together PowerPoint because we wouldn't be professors if we didn't use PowerPoint. So hang on a second. I hope this works. All right. Are you seeing it?
No, Sal.
No. Oh, right. We went through this rigmarole yesterday where I had to figure out how to get it to go so you can see it. Hold on a second. Let me give it another shot. And let's see. Yeah, that's the other part of being a professor is like we're always having to mess around with our technology and make sure it's working. And even after we've tested it, it still doesn't always work the way we want it to. So let's make sure we can do it again. All right. I'm going to start slideshow. Set up slideshow.
Nope.
Huh. No, still not working. All right. Maybe I'm just gonna maybe show you the slides one at a time then. Is that working now or?
You can see that. Did you do that change to the individual?
Yeah, I did. And it's still, I don't know, today, it worked the other day, I swear you guys. All right. Let's see.
Yeah, why don't you just show the preview?
I'll just show the slides from my screen then. Okay. I apologize. We tried to, this worked the other time we just did this, so. Okay. All right. So. All right, last time. I swear this is going to work.
All right.
Okay. So to get started, we're going to talk today about what we're calling the Anti-Racism Starter Pack. And what we mean by that is these are 5 ideas that we consider sort of basic, essential, foundational to having an informed and productive discussion on race, racism, and anti-racism. So we're coming into Tracy and I are both coming into this conversation today with a particularly vested interest in these topics as professors of anthropology, as individuals and citizens, members of our society, and as parents. So that's how we're coming into this, and we're hoping to, by being upfront about this, that we're just sort of trying to situate where ideas are coming from, why we're thinking about race, racism, and anti-racism in these particular ways. So, for example, because we're both professors of anthropology, what that means is we're experts in the study of humanity. So I'm just noting that right now because I did not actually take a class in anthropology as an undergraduate. So, so for those of us who are sort of new to anthropology, unfamiliar with it, making this claim that it's a study of humanity is a fairly grandiose claim, right? But what I love about this discipline is that what we're really interested in is people, in being human. And as a biological anthropologist, Tracy approaches humans more particularly in terms of our biology. And as a cultural anthropologist, I'm looking particularly at humans more in terms of culture and society. But when you take those perspectives together, what we're talking about is a holistic way of understanding humans, of thinking about people as biological and as social and cultural beings. And I think that perspective is particularly important when we're talking about something like race, right, or racism, because there are claims that are being made about biology, and they have direct impact on our cultural and social lives. And it's those cultural ideas that we have about biology, right, that make those kinds of impacts. So I just want to also note that as college professors, we really do see ourselves in our students, right? So they come into our classes with their own experience and their own knowledge, and as well as their sometimes untested preconceptions. So it's really our responsibility and our privilege to guide our students toward challenging themselves to sometimes unlearn what they think they already know, right? And so that's one of the things that's sort of one of the starting points for this conversation today, is that I think all of us come into a conversation about race and racism with our own experience and our own knowledge, but also with certain kinds of preconceptions that maybe haven't been thought through all the way. So enter our anti-racist starter pack, right? So our aim here is, look, we believe in education. We believe in pursuing lifelong learning, right? And so we feel like if we're going to have a healthy, productive conversation to move ourselves forward, let's start, right, with some basics. So it's important to know it for ourselves so that we have the confidence and the information to go into these conversations, which can sometimes be uncomfortable, right? We want to have confidence and knowledge because we want to be able to educate and guide others. And also sometimes we're going to need to fight back and call out ignorance and lies and misinformation, right? And so it helps when we know that, look, I have a pretty sturdy understanding of these facts. So that's what we're hoping to offer today. So what's in our starter pack, right? So these are 5 things. So we figured, hey, a starter pack usually has 5 items. So here are 5 things that we think are a good place to start to have this healthy conversation, productive conversation about race, racism, and anti-racism. So I'm just going to introduce these points here, and then we're going to go into them in more detail. There are no biological races. Race is a cultural idea. Race is not a biological reality, but racism is real. Racism hurts all of us. And we can learn anti-racism and invent new ways of seeing and being. Okay. So I think Tracy, you're taking over here. So
Yep, I'll take over with the first one. There were animations that we won't see, so you'll have to pardon if some of the slides look a little bit funny because the animations aren't there. But I'm going to tackle the first one here, that in fact, there are no biological races. So the first thing is that biological variation does not fall along racial lines. So study after study, whether you're looking at DNA or specific physical traits, it does not fall along racial lines. And I think the biggest reason for this is we forget, or we never knew, that the racial categories we especially use in the United States are based on something that Johann Blumenbach made up several hundred years ago. He created them. There is nothing natural about them. This is something that this guy, who was attempting to categorize people, made these racial categories. And it was a first distinct movement away from using geography. Prior to him, anytime they were categorizing, they were saying they were putting people into categories based on the continent or the region that they were from. Keeping in mind, if we go back 400 or 500 years, people generally, were born, lived, and died in a small area. People didn't move around the world as much. So that kind of grouping made sense. He was the first to move away from that and to use predominantly skin color, and in addition to some other features, to develop these races. And they are the foundation of the race concept still used in the United States today. So I think that's an important thing for us to remember, is he made up the races. Go ahead and scroll down. All right. The classic traits used to define races also don't fall into neat categories. So the one that's most classically used in America is skin color. We look at somebody's skin color and we assign them to a racial category. And as you can see there, perhaps when we look at the woman all the way to the left and the woman all the way to the right, we see there is a difference. Someone with very light skin color, someone very dark skin color. This becomes apparent. They are different skin colors. We would recognize them as different races. But what happens to all the people in the middle? Racial categories assume that the traits we're looking at fall into categories rather than a continuous range of variation. That skin color ranges from the very lightest to the very darkest, and most people fall somewhere in between. And skin color, of course, is an adaptation to UV radiation. And so when we map something like skin color according to geography, based on where you're coming from, not where you yourself are born, but where your sort of family originates, we can see that darkest skin colors are closest to the equator, and they get progressively lighter as you move towards the poles where there's less UV radiation. So skin color is used as the foundation for the racial concept, but skin color is not categorical. It doesn't fall into white, black, and that's it. There is so many shades in between. Scroll next up. And so here we're looking at another way to look at skin color, and that is with skin reflectance. And so you're looking at this graph. You don't really have to understand a whole lot about it, but as you go to the left, the skin color is darker. As you go to the right, the skin color is lighter. And various ethnic groups are charted on this for their skin colors. The blue dot in the middle of each line represents the average. The black bars then represent the range of variation for a particular population. So if we're going to make a category out of something like skin color, you're going to have white and black. The question becomes, well, where do you draw the line? What's white? What's black? So you say, okay, we're just going to go right there in the middle. And I drew that line down the middle and said, great, that's the thing. So to the left of that, you're black. To the right of that, you're white. Except if you look at those populations that are circled in the middle, now part of their population is white and part of their population is black. Because it's not categorical data. We're not talking about either one or the other. There's so much range of variation in between. So it leaves several groups that would be really difficult to categorize if you're going to do something as sort of arbitrary as just drawing a dividing line. It would be the same if you looked at height and we said, okay, we're going to make two groups, tall and short, and we're going to use 5'5" as the difference. If you're greater than 5'5", you're tall. If you're less than 5'5", you're short. Well, what about someone who's 5'5.1" and somebody else who's 5'4.9"? They'd be virtually identical, but they would fall into two different categories because it's a range of variation. It's not categorical. Another way we can look at this is that a race assumes that there are traits that are unique to a particular race, that if you bring up a particular racial trait or any kind of physical trait, you will only find it in one group, so that if someone has that trait, that tells you that they belong to that group. So it's unique to the group, only found in that group. But there absolutely is no physical trait that you can come up with that this is true. So, for example, freckles. So you would assume freckles, that would indicate somebody of European ancestry, light skin. But here we have Morgan Freeman, who's African-American. We have Lucy Liu, Asian-American, both with freckles. It may be that freckles are more common on lighter skin, but it doesn't mean it is a marker of being white or European-based. Likewise, I like to bring up hair color. I have naturally blonde hair. We assume that's European, but here we see people from Australian Aborigines who have naturally blonde hair. It may be more common for blonde hair to be associated with lighter skin colors, but it is not the rule. There is no trait that will define a race. So you can't say you have this, therefore you are that. It doesn't work.
Tracy, can I interject and ask a quick question that someone's asking? You're talking about, there being no biological races. Someone says, Jennifer asks, what about ethnicity? How is that defined? Or maybe that's something you're going to get to.
No, I think this is a good question. We don't specifically address that. We tend to hear ethnicity used as a euphemism for race. People don't want to say the R word, so they use ethnicity. Ethnicity is also a cultural construct, as Sallie will talk about. Race is something that is developed socially. It isn't based on a particular biological trait. And when we talk about ethnic groups, so let's say, I'm a mixed bag from Europe, but let's say I was just German. Okay, let's say all my ancestors were German and I'm German. There still is no trait, genetic or otherwise, that they could look at and be like, oh, she's German. That it just does not exist. And that is sort of contrary. I know there's all kinds of DNA testing out there with ancestry.com and places like that, where you send in your cheek swab and they tell you what you are. They're guessing. It's an educated guess, but there is no genetic marker that says you're from Switzerland, you're from Kenya, you're from Japan. There just isn't. So in that way, it's very, very similar. Ethnicity is a culturally constructed idea.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in there, as a cultural anthropologist, when we talk about ethnicity, we often have to go to some trouble to distinguish it from something like nationality, right? So like if we think about, like, for example, like to be Swiss or to be German, right? Those are associated with modern nation states and with certain kinds of boundaries. Or think about Italy, and Italian ethnicity, right? So people, I think when they're talking about something like German or Swiss or Italian or Korean or whatever as ethnicity, they're really talking about some notion of shared heritage, some notion of shared culture and language, right? Whereas, but they often sort of overlap with ideas about modern nationhood. So, if you think about Italy or Germany, these are like modern nations, right? So there was no like Germany in the 19th century. You had a bunch of like different principalities and kingdoms, and same with Italy, right? So it is kind of interesting that I think these days, when there's a lot of confusion about ethnicity and questions that come across something like ancestry.com, there's this way in which we mix up these modern nationalities and these ideas about like shared cultures and histories, and then we also sort of muddle them with race somehow, right? But I think they're all in the pursuit of trying to figure out, where do people come from? How do I identify, right? How do I distinguish myself from others? But also, how do I find belonging with other people, right? So yeah, it's a really, in other words, there's no short answer about race and ethnicity. And certainly when you ask anthropologists these questions, like, we'll go on. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks.
All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, so we're really bad at identifying people's race in a lot of situations. Now, someone like me who's incredibly light-skinned, it might seem obvious that I am of European ancestry, but it's not necessarily the case. And see, when we had the animations, you wouldn't have seen the answers right away for these, but if you look at these three women, they don't at all fit what we would have expected. I'm guessing, especially the lady on the left and the woman in the middle, we would have probably said European. They're very light-skinned, they have lighter eyes. But the lady on the left is Asian. She's Filipino. The woman in the middle is from Egypt, so she's African. The woman to the right may have been thought to be Asian potentially, but she's African. She's from Algeria. So our ability to correctly identify someone's race, in other words, where are they originating from, where's their family from, we're really, really bad at that, which also just sort of underscores how inaccurate the racial concept is as far as a biological accuracy. And so again, our expectations of race do not match reality. That is the biggest situation, is we expect certain things. We expect if we see blonde hair that means that they're European. And then we don't know what to do with it when we're confronted with somebody who has dark hair and dark skin and blonde hair. We don't really know how to handle that because it's outside of our expectations. So the other question then is, what about genetics? What about on the genetic level? And many studies have shown that race does not predict genetic relatedness. So you are equally genetically related to anyone within or outside of your racial category. So I would be identifying as European American or European ancestry, Sally recognizing or identifying as someone of Asian ancestry. We are as equally related and as equally different from each other as I am to somebody who is also identified as European or white, as she is to somebody who is also Asian. So you can't look at genetics and predict who's going to be related to each other in terms of racial categories. And I also like to point out that humans overall, we are really genetically similar. Modern humans have only originated a relatively short period of time ago. And so we don't have a lot of genetic variation. It's pretty superficial. And so one example is, in comparison, is penguins, which I think we would all assume look pretty much the same, have twice the genetic diversity that humans have. So there's more variation in penguins than there is in humans, which I think in some ways is a bit mind-blowing and hard to wrap your mind around. But the idea is that a couple of the traits that vary and vary according to geography, like skin color, are so visual to us so that it seems like there's more difference than there really is. And so what does this all mean? Again, that humans are remarkably similar. There is very, very little that differentiates us, and it does not follow along racial lines. In summary, races are basically just a really crappy attempt at attempting to identify real human variation. We are not trying to argue that all humans are the same. We're just saying races do not properly classify that, because so much of the variation is continuous, that it's a range of variation, that it doesn't fit into those categories.
Yeah. So this brings us to the idea that race is a cultural idea. So I'm going to pick that up a little bit. So to get into this, I'm going to recap 2 points that Tracy just made, which is that differences certainly do exist among humans. So differences simply in physical appearance, right? That's the first thing we often notice about each other. And actually, some of those particular, I mean, think about all the kinds of things that you could differentiate among individuals, right? Or groups of people even. And all those differences, right? But the differences that are particularly used to talk about race, to create these categories of race. So when we use these ideas about skin color, what's interesting is those very visible characteristics, which are actually pretty superficial, and yet have come to symbolize even greater differences. So historically, those differences in physical appearance, which are pretty superficial and really don't explain much of anything about anything else that we think is important about human beings, people used to think they did tell you something, so that if you looked at someone, you knew something about their behaviors or their abilities or their practices or their ideas, right? So that's the notion of biological race, that somehow these external differences were going to predict or correspond to other really important characteristics or variation in people, right? So that's a very powerful claim. So that's that third point I want to make here on this slide, which is that, you know, this idea that the relatively minor differences in physical appearance tell you something more about what human differences really are. It's a false claim, but it's also a very powerful claim, right? And it's a powerful claim that's been used to excuse differences, that is inequalities, right, and injustices. It's also, as a claim, it's one that is learned and taught. So as a cultural anthropologist, I want to emphasize how important that is to recognize, right? That these ideas that we have about race are, as Tracy just went through, they don't really have any big biological significance in terms of like skin color. What does it really mean? It means that your ancestors were adapted to certain in certain regions of the world about having to do with vitamin D and about UV exposure, right? But it's really, it doesn't mean these other things that skin color has come to stand for. That's where culture comes in. So we started out by telling you, like, so Tracy and I both teach introduction to, she teaches introduction to biological anthropology. I teach introduction to cultural anthropology. Our whole life is teaching undergraduate students anthropology, and race and racism stuff is a really huge part of what we teach in those classes, right? And so one of the things that I really like to bring up when I teach about race has to do with, look, there's a big red flag in that nobody seems to really know how many races there are, right? So when I point out to students, when I ask students, how many races do you think there are? And they'll say, well, are there like 3, are there 4, are there 5? This is an illustration that I sometimes show my students that actually gets at, I think this one portrays like 5 major race groups with 30 subcategories. This was an illustration in like a British textbook or reference book from like the 1910s, right? So that's one way that people have decided, like that's one answer, right? And then you take a look at something like the US Census, right? And over the years, historically, it's changed what the categories that the US Census Bureau uses and asks people to identify themselves to be counted, right? So we are in a census year, right? And so this is a news report showing that actually the number of categories that we use has grown over time. So back in 1790, in the first US Census, there were 3 categories, and it's really interesting to see what those categories were. They were free white, other free, and slave, right? So they were not, so what's interesting is like, it's interesting to look at like, what were the relevant facts about people? There were relevant distinctions about people they were trying to collect here, right? In 2020, and I have to go look at my notes a little bit. In 2020, like the categories, when they ask you about race, and maybe some of us have filled out our census, and I actually filled it out when I got it, so I couldn't remember. I had to go back and look it up. But the categories they ask are white, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, or some other race. And then those of us who mark Asian or Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander can also mark from additional subcategories. So according to the US Census, Korean and Samoan are subcategories of race, which I think is interesting. So it's not marked as ethnicity, right? And then in addition, there is a separate question on Hispanic origins, right? And so the US Census goes to a lot of trouble to like try to get all this like finer grained categorization going on. And one has to wonder, to what purpose? Now, what I think is really important to note is that the US Census Bureau, in asking all of these questions about races, they do make it clear that they're using what they call the social categories that are likely familiar to most people who are participating in the census, right? So, and I just want to put in a plug for, if you haven't filled out your census, right? answer it, because the reasons why, there are really important reasons why we all need to be counted, and those include fairer representation and distribution of resources, right? So I think it's interesting to think about, like, if there were a real reality to biological race, we would expect that there is a clear, definitive answer to how many races are there. And yet what we see is it's very variable, right? It's changed historically. It also can change based on what you are asking that information for, right? So, in other words, these are categories that I think the census is correct to say that these are social categories that we use for certain kinds of purposes, right, in our lives. And depending on those purposes, we're going to ask for more or less detail on that, right? So, whoa, where did I go? Hey. All right. I also just want to point out that I want to dive into a little bit of a history lesson here, which is that, I was thinking about, well, why, maybe some of you are asking yourselves the same question, like, why do races exist? Like, why did we have to invent categories of race at all, right? And why are they based on physical appearance? So, and I think it's really important to ask ourselves those kinds of questions, right? About why, what is it about the differences that we see among humans? What do we think are the important differences? And then what do we do with those ideas, right? Those perceptions. So I think it's interesting to note that physical appearances became pegged to other kinds of attributes, including behaviors and abilities, that there was this way in which looking at skin color was assumed to tell you about character or about ability or cognition. And we know over time and actually even people like who are thinking that, like, back in the day, probably understood that was just simply not true. There were too many exceptions to their rules, right? But I think it's really interesting to point out that there wasn't just one way of answering the question of what human difference is about. So as a cultural anthropologist, I think it's really important to recognize that, like, pegging all that's interesting and variable about humans and assuming that it's somehow inborn and unchanging and natural and biological, that's a particular way of looking at the world. And the other possibility is to understand that a lot of the most important differences that we do see among people in habit, in beliefs, in behaviors, right, in ideas and practices, those are not inborn, those are learned, right? Those are taught. In other words, those are cultural differences. So it seems to me that a lot of the most significant things that we're talking about when we're talking about human variation is not just really those superficial differences in physical appearance. It's about these other habits and things that we've learned and taught. And so those things are not actually unchangeable and durable, right? So all of this leads us to this point that I think the sum of what Tracy and I just said in points 1 and 2 about that race is not a biological reality, but that racism is quite real. That, in other words, the effects of this cult. So if we think of the concept of race as something that we've made up, right? It doesn't mean that the effects of it are made up. There's this quote that I'm showing you right now that I think is, I think about a lot, actually. So Alan Goodman is a biological anthropologist who's done quite a bit of work on racism and anti-racism. And he makes the point, the question is not whether race is real, but in what ways do we make it a reality, and how does that affect lives? Right. So in other words, as anthropologists like Tracy can tell you all about, which she did, just give you a little taste of all the ways in which we understand that there is no substance to the claims about race being a biological reality, and yet it is very much a social reality. So thinking through how we've made it real, I think it's, I think it's really important that we as anthropologists in particular are cognizant of the history of our own discipline, right? That scientists have been involved in creating and promoting this concept of race that we're also now coming around to and debunking and trying to fight back against, right? So I also would want to point out that it's not just scientists in the way back bad old days, because we are always tempted to say, oh, that's what people used to think back then, and now we think differently now, right? We like to think about ourselves as part of a progressive narrative. But I think it's really important to recognize, and that's why we need the starter pack, that actually racist science is very much still in continuance today. So you'll see claims about the genetic basis of this, or the genetic basis of that, right? Or that actually, like, thought processes work differently. Like you'll see those kinds of studies being talked about, and sometimes what it is poorly interpreted research, right? Or you'll have truly biased science, I'll put in those scare quotes. So I think it's really important to have this starter pack, because we are still having to fight back against people who want to find evidence of, right, biological difference, of genetic difference. So if that's what you're looking for, right, and that's actually what early 19th or late 19th, early 20th century physical anthropologists and anthropologists were looking for that. So our discipline participated in some of that early racist thinking, right? And now we're very much involved in that anti-race, anti-racist kind of science. Another way in which we make race a reality is through our ordinary, everyday learning, teaching, and internalizing, right? So I think this point is made really poignantly, the way in which, like, we all learn and absorb these lessons that don't come to us as like direct didactic lessons, but that we just absorb from like people around us and attitudes and just things that we see and hear, right? So back in the 1930s and 40s, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, two psychologists, had done this really important research where they had a group of children, Black children in particular, and they had these dolls, right? One was a light-skinned, yellow-haired doll, a white doll, and then one was a black doll. And they would offer the dolls to the kids and ask the kids questions like, which one is the nice doll? Which one is the ugly doll? Which one is the pretty doll? Which one is the doll that behaves well? Like a series of those kinds of questions. And it just breaks your heart to know that actually what they found in these studies was that the Black children had internalized all kinds of messages in which they associated all these positive qualities to the white doll, and were more likely to see the Black dolls in terms of the negative qualities they were asked about, right? So actually this study, the Clark's doll study, is sort of a landmark. The Clarks end up actually testifying to the U.S. Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Ed. So they actually, their research was really important in terms of arguing against segregated schools and for integrated schooling, right? So, but I think it's also just this really important lesson about how absolutely powerful this learning, teaching, absorbing, internalizing is, that it's happening even when we don't really realize it's happening, right? And that's perhaps the most, I mean, as a cultural anthropologist, I'd say that's perhaps the most potent way that actually learning happens, is when we're sort of totally unaware that it's happening, right? The real effects. So Tracy and I are just going to talk about two examples. So while we've talked about how race has no biological reality, it really has real biological effects, in particular racism, that is the things that we do with these ideas about race, the inequalities and the discrimination and the practices we put into place because of these ideas about race, right? That one particular example is to think about the particular impacts of racism on Black women and mothers. So when Meredith introduced me before. So I do medical anthropology. My specialization is in the anthropology of reproduction. I'm really interested, I'm really concerned with issues around reproduction, right? And so one of the things that, I mean, this literally will like keep me up at night, is thinking about the particular impacts of racism on Black women and mothers. So according to the US Centers for Disease Control, which records these kinds of numbers, more than 3 times the number of Black women than white women died of pregnancy-related causes, right? And I don't think you can read the slide so well, so I'll read it for you. These disparities persisted over time and across age groups, and were present even in states with the lowest pregnancy-related mortality ratios, and among groups with higher levels of education, right? So that's just to point out that even when you control for all kinds of other conditions, social conditions, economic and so on, that even when you control for that, that Black women and mothers did less well than white women and mothers, right? And so I think it's really important to point out that actually medical researchers are taking quite seriously that the stresses of racism itself have these negative impacts on health, right? That racism itself, the social experience of it, does things to our bodies, right? That results in these really horrifying outcomes. Right? Yeah, I think Tracy, you're going to take on this.
I'm going to take this one. So we thought it would be really important to talk about COVID-19 since that's going on, and you've probably heard about the racial inequalities with that. Here you're looking at data from the Centers for Disease Control and other medical organizations. Communities of color have higher rates of cases, hospitalizations, and mortality. So I gave you 3 examples here. In New York City, you can see Black Americans make up 22% of the population, but 28% of COVID deaths. New York State, it's 9% of the population, but 18% of the deaths. And just another example, a little more extreme, from Milwaukee County in Wisconsin, Black Americans make up 26% of the population, but represent 73% of the deaths. Which begs the question, and why is this happening? Is it because dark skin makes you more vulnerable? No, not at all. There's nothing inherent about being a Black American that makes you more vulnerable in terms of your biology. But the experience of Black Americans, the racism, the institutionalized and structural racism that are faced on a daily basis, have already put them at risk for a lot of issues that then make them more vulnerable to COVID-19. And again, we're talking about systems of oppression and white supremacy. And again, here, we're not talking white supremacy as in the people who are in the Ku Klux Klan. We're talking about our institutionalized white supremacy, where whites are treated and assumed to be superior. We don't always recognize it, but that's the structure of sort of our society in the United States. So there's a role of racism in COVID-19 and a couple of major sources of it. So as Sallie was pointing out with the pregnancy-related deaths, discrimination in things like healthcare, housing, education, finance, and so forth results in higher levels of chronic stress. Higher levels of chronic stress have really negative effects on the body, including on the immune response and the ability of the body to fight off infections and viruses and bacteria. Secondly, the healthcare access and use. Who has health insurance? Who's more likely to not be insured? What's someone's access to transportation and childcare and the ability to take time off work when they are sick or to go to the doctor? And we know there's historic and current discrimination in the healthcare system that is impacting populations of color. Third, occupation. Populations of color are disproportionately represented in a lot of the essential services. And so therefore, they're more likely to be exposed. So if you look at farms, factories, grocery stores, things like that, that have had to keep going, there is a higher number of people of color who are not able to work from home. And so they have increased risk of exposure. And then there's 2 more that go along with this, educational, income, and wealth gaps. And again, this is going to affect what kind of education you have access to, what kind of job that means you get, what kind of flexibility you have with your job, and whether you can even afford to miss work, because many people are employed in positions where if they don't work, they don't have paid sick leave. And so then it's a question of, do I go to the work sick, or do I get kicked out of my house because I'm not bringing an income? And then lastly, housing. We maybe see more cases of differences in crowded living conditions, or families who have multiple generations living in one household, which facilitates the spread of COVID-19. Having more crowded conditions, more people living together, also makes it more difficult to follow prevention strategies. Populations of color have disproportionately higher unemployment rates, which means that they also end up being more likely to be evicted and more likely to become homeless. All of which, of course, living in a shelter, if you're homeless, is going to increase your risk of contracting COVID-19. So being a person of color, there's nothing biological that's making you more at risk for COVID-19. But again, that institutionalized systemic racism and the many effects that and many sort of areas of life that are impacted by it puts populations of color at greater risk for COVID-19 contraction and then having the worst complications.
Right. So this brings us to point 4, which is point 4 of the anti-racism starter pack is the recognition that racism hurts all of us, right? And this is a point I wanted to build off of what Tracy was saying about COVID-19. So I have to say that for me, the events of this spring, which include this pandemic that we are all still going through and the suffering is brought upon all of us, and Black and brown people especially, the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others whose names we need to speak. And then the days and weeks of protests that have followed, right? These events have quite clearly revealed how much racism is hurting all of us. And actually, I feel like maybe there's something about this time that we've all come to the realization that a reckoning is much needed, right? That we're much reflecting on this moment and understanding in a way that maybe we didn't stop to necessarily before. We're also recognizing the extent to which ideas about race and practices of racism, that structural and institutional racism that Tracy was just referring to, that they really in fact, I want to use that metaphor, like all of the interconnected parts of our society. So I'm going to get a little personal for a second here. So I am American born and raised as the daughter of Asian immigrants from Korea. And I've been thinking a lot about anti-Asian racism in this moment. There's all this talk about a China virus, right? There's and I see that as very much linked to the perception of Asians in America as perpetual foreigners and as outside threats, right? There's also quite a bit of xenophobia going on at the moment, right? So there's all this political rhetoric about China and about China being, so that there's this U.S.-China political relations are not so great. They're even talking about banning TikTok, right? Because it's owned by a Chinese company, right? And all this is also going on in the context of with the China virus and the so-called China virus and the perception of Asians as perpetual foreigners. There has been an increase in violent physical attacks and biased incidents against persons of Asian heritage in the country. We saw something like this also in the days after 9/11, right? That we saw people, that Muslim Americans also being targeted, right? So I've been thinking about those connections between this anti-Asian racism because I'm so aware of them. But I also, at the same time, think it is really important to recognize the connections between that anti-Asian racism and, frankly, to recognize also Asian anti-Black racism, right? So this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. I think there is absolutely a critical need for Asians in America to confront our own learning, teaching, and internalization of these ideas about race, which include perceptions about both Black people and whiteness, right? So in anthropology, we talk about this as part of a decolonization effort. So in other words, where do Asian people get their ideas about race, right? Why are they looking at Black people in America as something different, right? So this is all part of an understanding of people, right, of races, and it's part of like it's, you know, it not only empowered the enslavement of Black people, it also empowers a broader colonial and imperial project. So on what grounds can you occupy other people's lands and take it over, right? Because apparently they don't deserve it on some level, right? And you do. So that's, I think that logic really needs to be examined, and that when we start to look at it that way, we can look at all of this racism as really part of the branches of the same tree, right? And so in that way, that racism are branches of these different racisms are branches of the same tree. I also think that anti-racism is a project that requires all of us to work on together, right? So that brings us to point 5, which is hopefully we don't come away from this despairing and discouraged. If there's anything that I find really inspiring as a cultural anthropologist, it's that think of it this way: like, as humans, we invent so many things to meet our various purposes. And when those inventions are no longer doing what we need or want them to do, we are remarkably creative, adaptive, innovative, and we are able to change and to make something else, right? So when we understand that race is made up and that racism is learned and taught, then there's also the possibility that we can make up something new, right? Make up something different, undo this stuff, right? And learn something, teach something else instead, right? So I just want to emphasize, and Tracy and I will sort of take turns on this, but that's our hope for all of us, is to take this, to recognize it is in our power to do something about all this, that what we're hoping is that we just hopefully handed you this anti-racism starter pack that you can share with others, right? That you can now talk with your friends and your family and with other people, but also hear what they have to say, right? But you have something to say back. But then also, we would encourage people to add to the starter pack, right? It's just a starter pack. So seek out reading, listen to some blogs, or read some blogs, listen to podcasts, like watch some films. And then, of course, stay tuned for more events at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, because they have a fabulous lineup that I'm signing up for. But yeah, I mean, Tracy, did you want to add something to that? Or
I guess just building on what you said, that this is just a starting point. We really hope that you will take this, think about it, reflect on it, and have conversations with other people, have the uncomfortable conversation. And like she said, also add to your knowledge and look up things. There's great resources out there that really will supplement and help you understand more of different aspects of what we've covered here.
So we just want to close with our thanks to Dyckman Farmhouse Museum for inviting us and for including us in this conversation, to our department, to our colleagues in our department, and everyone who joined. Like, I am amazed that that this many people would want to spend part of a Wednesday evening with us talking about this. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. So while you've been talking, and this has been fascinating, we've had questions just rolling in.
Okay.
So I figured I'll just dive in and ask you the questions, and you guys can take turns or however you want to do it. So the first question, which has 9 votes, is what are some strategies for raising anti-racist children?
Oh my.
That is such a good question. If anybody else has some other tips that they could lend us, like, please. So my kids are 16 and 13, and I'm pretty sure we started talking about race when they were very, very young, right? Or rather, we were talking about racism and anti-racism, right? So the anthropology stuff that Tracy and I just went through, they probably learned that more recently because they needed a certain amount. They couldn't just be 3 and 5 years old to but we started talking with them quite early about like, hey, like people perceive these differences, and we also tried to read to them about history. There's some excellent like picture books and stuff. So it's not that I wanted to make it threatening or scary or anything, but I also didn't want to like make it seem less important, that, you know, because it's important. So I think I think the important thing that I tried to do was to talk about it early, right? And also it's kind of like giving the talk to them about like having periods or having sex or stuff like that. Like I wanted them to feel like they could talk to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted them to ask me their questions, and if I didn't feel like particularly well informed, that we were going to look it up together. Yeah, I mean, Tracy, what did you?
My kids are 6 and 8, so we're early in the process. I think vigilance is a huge part of it. We've been, you know, we actively find things to supplement what they're getting at school, especially in terms of history and like that. I have plans for my poor children. I have plans for when they're teenagers on stuff that they're going to be reading and doing, because I know what the curriculum is going to be. I know what's missing from the curriculum. So I think the vigilance is a big part of it. It can be hard not to get a bit discouraged, but it is lots of conversations. My older child, it was hard, even though we try not to have news on constantly because he's quite sensitive and we don't, you know, want to depress him. But he, of course, heard about George Floyd, so we had a conversation about that. He's brought it up before. And so also sort of teaching him some activism and what he can do as an 8-year-old boy. You know, he made his own Black Lives Matter sign for his bedroom window. He keeps chalking it on the driveway, you know, so talking to them about what they can do and where they can feel some kind of power. And we, you know, doing that. But I think the vigilance and also just supplementing, because they're going to get the same basic curriculum that supports the sort of systemic white supremacist notion of the United States. So it's actively fighting against that.
Thank you. And I've done some of those things with my kids as well. And also one of our viewers, who is a colleague of ours from the New York Public Library from our local branch, posted in the chat a link that the public library has put together of books for raising anti-racist children.
Yeah.
So take a look at that as well, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question, 4 votes. How would you two recommend we, people who run cultural organizations, collect demographic information when we're specifically working to engage more people of color? Is there a better way to ask, what race or ethnicity do you most closely identify with?
Well, I think sort of what we've talked about is race is not a biological reality, but it doesn't mean that race isn't real. And that's not, you know, that in the United States, it's how we self-identify, it's how we identify others. It's, you know, it is used. So I don't think it's a problem of using that, because especially it's important to make sure we're getting representation, that we're being inclusive. We have to ask these things like affirmative action. It's important to be able to do those things. So the whole thing we're talking about isn't that race doesn't exist. It does. It's just not biological. And so I don't think there is other ways to ask about those things if you're trying to have representation and reaching a variety of people. I think that that's, in some ways, it's what we have to do because it's the system we're working with.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, and I really like Tracy's answer, because it is true. It's one of those things like, oh, like, are we reproducing the same problematic categories because we have to? So it's like there is a chicken and egg kind of problem here going on, right? Which is like, well, in order to like provide the services and reach the people that we want, we need to know how many people are out there, and there are specific communities there that we're really concerned about engaging, right? And so we need to be able to count. And yet there's this worry that, well, are we just simply reproducing these categories in part, you know, potentially harmful ways. But so it is a I think as long as we're trying to fight that good fight, right, make that good trouble, that we're trying to actually, I think it's part of a conversation. I remember having a conversation with, I think I was the student at the time, and I was having a conversation with a mentor because it was bothering me at the time that whenever you filled out a form for like employment or for the college or something, that they kept asking these race questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really like, so there I am, like 20, 21 years old, and I'm like, why do they keep asking? I'm going to say, no, I don't want to answer. Right. And then my mentor pointed out to me, like, well, if you don't tell them, then they don't know that you're here. Right. You just go into this like category of did not answer, and they have no idea whether there are any Asian students or Asian employees at this organization. Mm-hmm. Like, and they need to know that, right? So and I was like, oh, I never thought of it that way, right? Like I didn't understand why they were asking me this question over and over again. And so it helped me think through, like, okay, like maybe that is really important. Maybe I should actually answer that question. And I understood it, that they were accounting for a purpose. They weren't asking me as an individual. They were trying to do something else, right? So once I understood their purpose, I'm like, okay, I'm going to help you play this game, right? I'm going to help you get better representation. So it became something where, yeah, it's tricky because like when you're asking like on a survey, you don't get to spend a lot of time having that conversation, right? Yeah.
Well, and to go back to what we were talking about, for example, with the differences in maternal mortality, if they aren't collecting data according to racial category, we would not be aware that there's this massive disparity. So even though it isn't a biological category, it is how people are seen and treated. And if we're going to address those issues, we have to know what issues exist.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. I think we talked about this one already, but if there's anything you want to add, someone typed in what's the difference between race and ethnicity, but this might have been before you address that. So up to you if you want me to just go to the next one.
Oh, well, we could we did talk about that but just to say real quickly, we just want to reiterate. So, oh my gosh, you're asking two anthropologists to talk about two things that are sort of like hardcore anthropology, right? Like we could go on for pages.
You have to give them the Cliff Notes version.
Yeah. But in a nutshell, what we were talking about is that this talk was really about thinking through these sort of unspoken assumptions people, like by now that when people say race, it's just this tip of the iceberg in terms of like all these other ideas that are attached to it that we don't even realize are still there. And so when you wonder why race operates the way it does in our society, or race categories, it's because it has all this baggage. It has like all the stuff underneath the surface. And we were trying to reveal some of that. So race is this idea of like these like biological differences that supposedly like existed among different groups, different groupings of people. Ethnicity, we talked about before in terms of like, it's about a shared heritage, about a shared history, shared language and culture. It's, Tracy was pointing out that it sometimes gets used interchangeably, like the polite way of talking about race. And it's also meant to be a way of grouping people, but maybe not based on sort of these biological categorizations, more like these like linguistic and cultural, right? And then we also talked about how that has to be separated from nationality, because nationalities are modern constructs. A lot of nationalities are like 20th century, 21st century constructs. They don't even go back further than the late 1800s. So hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. The next one is, how do we capture data on marginalized, disadvantaged, or underserved communities without asking for race?
Well, I think that's
another earlier question.
I think you have to, and I don't think there is another thing you can do.
Yeah, we were just talking about that before in terms of that it's this interesting bind. I was thinking, and Tracy, when you were talking about the having to collect data about there is a problem there with pregnancy-related deaths, right? That we understand that for some reason, right, there are groups of that women, because they are being categorized a certain way socially, like you look at people and they're treated differently, right, and they're subjected to certain kinds of treatment and institutionalized, right. We do need to document that. And the same with early on with the COVID-19 statistics, if you recall, they were not tracking that by race and ethnicity. And that was they were aggregating all those numbers. And we realized pretty early on that that was problematic because people in healthcare understood that this was not affecting everybody the same way, right? And that it was going to be really important to understand why this was affecting different groups of people differently. And so these are our relevant social categories that have health, life, death consequences. And so it's one of those, I liken it to sort of like the issue of like color blindness. We can't do color blindness, right? We need to recognize what those categories mean and what they don't mean, right? And that's the only way that maybe we can start to dismantle some of those practices of racism. But at the same time, we do need to know exactly what is going on, right? And so so it's this tricky thing that we have to like know what's going on with these social categories. Therefore, we need to collect data using those social categories. And at the same time, we're trying to expose that those social categories are really just made up, right? So they're two projects that have to move together somehow.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is, let's see, how do we communicate with people who don't want to have the uncomfortable conversations and pretend there is no problem?
That's the problem, right? If someone is not willing to listen, how do you reach them? I don't think we have an answer particularly for that, because I think that's what everyone is looking is how do you do that? I think trying not to make someone defensive, so not being like, why would you think of something so stupid? Like trying not to put them on the defensive is very helpful to sort of, well, why would you think that? And sort of drawing them into a conversation and maybe, tackling it slightly differently so that they're a little more open to it versus saying, America's racist is going to really upset people and put, if someone, that's not true, they're done listening to you. But if you say, did you notice the difference in COVID deaths? Why do you think that, and that kind of more gentle opening, I think maybe gets you a little further.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure that I have any good advice, on how to open up those conversations. I feel like I'm like a sort of non-confrontation. I don't like to get into that, but if I have to, I will. But I'm not the person who usually fires the opening salvo, right? So, I think for me, it's been a matter of listening and then sort of like Tracy said, inserting something here and there, right? Yeah. I think also I'm just trying to think about these incidents that I have had. I'll admit though, during the last couple of years, since Charlottesville, right, and the Confederate, all that stuff, and was it 2017? I have felt bolder about just coming out and saying things because it's in the news, everybody's talking about these things, and when I say it, I'm not. When I introduce topics, it's not to be. I often use I language. It's how they say use language. So I'm I'm really upset about that. So I usually start with me, because maybe that's a little less threatening. If I say you should think this way, right? Whereas I'm feeling really upset and I'm worried about this, and that becomes a way of having a conversation about maybe this other person's going to just change the subject. That's fine. Then I know that person is not ready, right? So
Okay, thank you. All right, I don't want to keep you all night, but I have a couple more questions for you, and then we will
This is awesome.
wrap.
Questions?
Great. So one person wrote, "What are your thoughts on the word Black capitalized versus lowercase Black?"
I'm an uppercase. I think uppercase matters. I do. I just think it matters. We capitalize things that are important, like names and places and things like that. So I'm an uppercase person. I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, I've kind of been using uppercase B for a while now, so I was really pleased to see that AP and others have like actually updated their style. Because I used to be a journalist. I worked at the New York Daily News before I went into anthropology. So I thought that was a really good move. I do understand. I mean, I can see why people are confused, right? Because they're like, but I think part of it is recognizing that you know there's something really powerful about the fact that people are like, so in other words, like, you don't get to name me, right? I'm going to claim this name and I'm going to claim it as my identity, right? And you should respect that is the idea. Or that's how I interpret this move toward using Black and using capital B Black, right? So it's not just like, because I think a lot of people I'm almost 50. So I'll just admit that. So as I was growing up, I was told that you should use the word African American, right? Like that's how that you're not supposed to say Black. And so I think it's really interesting because like, I think there's a lot of people who were raised like understanding that African American was a more proper way of calling people than Black. And so I think that's part of the discomfort is like people are catching up with like, I don't even know what words I'm supposed to use. Right.
True. Okay, great. So next question is, can you discuss whether disparities of income parallel disparities of race?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of data showing the wealth gap. All you have to do is you can do a straight line back to the Reconstruction era and the returning of plantations to Confederate soldiers, to the redlining of housing, to the massive differences in wealth. And in fact, since the civil rights movement, the wealth gap has increased, which is incredibly depressing. It has gotten worse, which just means we have sort of entrenched ourselves in being concerned. I think the civil rights movement scared a lot of white people. And so those, especially in powerful positions, entrenched themselves and really worked hard on preventing what they thought was going to happen if, the negative things that would happen if people of color were treated the same, that somehow it would mean that they would lose something. And we see that the wealth gap in particular has completely increased, and it's incredibly frustrating. And again, you go back to access to education, access to job opportunities. And so if you have limited opportunities and you're working a job that is paycheck to paycheck, no, you're not going to be able to buy a house. And buying a house for most Americans is where their wealth is coming from. And there's massive differences based on race in home ownership.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I think I have one more for you. And there's a little back and forth here in this question box. I know that qualitative data is more biased than quantitative. How does the study of anthropology and societies battle with collecting data and coming to these conclusions?
Ooh, what do you mean by bias? Qualitative data, I mean, remember, keeping in mind that so I'm going to speak as an ethnographer and someone who does like interview-based stuff that's based on participant observation. Stuff that people say is like biased, right? Or subjective somehow. Remember what we're studying. Like the object of something like cultural anthropology and ethnography in particular is about experience. How are people experiencing a particular historical moment, some kind of process, whatever it is, right? I don't know how else you get at documenting and collecting data on experience, right? Except by like the nearest things that I can collect are narrative. I can get what people tell me about their experiences, right? And so I'm not even claiming that I understand what they feel or think. I can only tell you what they told me about what they feel or think or what they did. I can document what they do, right, by watching them. But then, of course, that's through my lens, right? I think, so I always think of something, qualitative data is, one, it's different what we're trying to document and measure, right? And so it demands different methods and it demands different kinds of data. I also think we try to be really honest and upfront about that, right? That, I always think it's really interesting when I talk to like someone like physics or chemistry, and they're actually often describing, they're not actually measuring something directly. They're often like, if you're an astrophysicist, you're having to measure something quite indirectly, right? And so you're using all kinds of proxies to get at that thing. So in a way, I don't really think that is that different from what I'm trying to do. It's just that they have maybe more standardized ways of looking at it. So,
and I'll add, quantitative data can be just as biased and just as manipulated. So they're like Sallie said, are oftentimes used to get to different things. So there's, if you're trying to get to certain questions, there's certain types of data that are going to be better in terms of giving you information. I'm a biological anthropologist, so I spend my days with skeletons. And for example, one of the things we do with a skeleton is be able to identify male versus female. And there's both visual assessment, where we can look at something and the shape and how it appears, and there's measurement. And when I teach my students, I almost invariably hear them expect that the measurement has got to be more accurate, and it's actually not. So there's kind of there's no overarching that quantitative is somehow better than qualitative. In certain settings and for certain things, one is better than the other, or more appropriate, or will give you more insight. But there isn't any kind of universal on those.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks.
It is.
You can tell it's a fun one for us to answer, actually. Thank you. Well, this has been fascinating. And someone wrote in the chat, I could listen to you guys talk all night, and I totally agree.
We could keep talking.
So, Sallie and Tracy, thank you so much. This has been a really, really fantastic discussion.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I just wanted to give a quick little prompt for the remainder of the lecture series. So I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did. And then I just wanted to remind you that this is the first of 4 lectures in our Talking About Race Matters lecture series. We hope that you'll join us every Wednesday at 6 o'clock here on Crowdcast. Be sure to register. Melissa's been putting the information in the chat for you. We will also provide links on our social media, and we hope to see you next week on Wednesday, August 12th at 6 p.m. for Driving While Black, Race, Space, and the Automobile by Dr. Gretchen Sullivan-Soren. Thanks, everyone, and have a fantastic evening. And thank you again, Tracy and Sallie.
Oh, thank you so much.
Have a great night.
Yeah, have a good night.